What I want to say from listening to people in the research project that I've been engaged in is that I think what we have in local congregations is a real hothouse of opportunities for people to learn to live by the golden rule. Partly it's just the networks and information sharing and the stuff that goes on in the hallways and on the bulletin boards and the announcements in the bulletin. Partly it's that they learn specific teachings. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. They hear that, they learn that. But they also have models around them of people doing that kind of stuff. And they hear stories about people who are held up as models, as heroes. And then they get a chance to practice it themselves, to take the casserole to the sick person, to participate in the food pantry, and so forth. There was a really interesting kind of subtle difference in the stories we heard from people who were not part of religious communities and the people who were. Now, on the one hand, you might be a little discouraged to hear that the people who were not part of religious communities were more likely to make a connection to larger structural kinds of issues when we ask, how could you make the world a better place? They were more likely to talk about laws and policies and so forth than the people who participated in religious communities. But what went with that is that they were more likely to say, there are terrible things in the world, it is a terrible problem, and somebody should do something about it. People who participated in religious communities said, there are terrible problems in the world, and we should do something about it. And they were, in fact, more likely to be engaged in doing something about it. Participation matters. And I want to say, I've been talking so far about kind of the effect out there, why the rest of the world should care about the work that goes on in local parishes. It's not just about being a good voluntary organization, of course. It's also about the fact that we are religious communities. We are communities of faith. We are communities where people pass on these traditions of virtue, where they are also invited into an opportunity to experience the presence of the divine. One way to look at why that turns out to be so important is to look at why people say they come back to church. The Pew Forum is the source of all those statistics about how many unaffiliated people there are, but they also ask people who used to be unaffiliated but have now affiliated, why did you come back? And the primary reason they came back, first of all, had to do with worship, and second, had to do with a sense of being called by God into the affiliation that they now have. Yeah, some of it has to do with, social stuff, moving into the community, marrying somebody, etc. But it's also fundamentally a spiritual process, a spiritual decision that people are engaged in. And it's that question of the nature of the spiritual life that people are engaged in their local congregations, but more importantly out there in the world that I've been working on in a project recently. I've been looking at how people tell the stories of their everyday lives. And does God show up in the story at all? Is there any sense of a spiritual significance to these stories about work and politics and the community and family and so forth? And the first thing I want to tell you is that a life story that has that kind of spiritual content, that kind of holiness, is much more likely to come from somebody who's an active participant in a religious community than from somebody who's not. Now, if anybody's surprised at that, please, I hope not. But with all the talk about being spiritual but not religious, about finding God on the golf course, I'm here to tell you that there just really aren't a whole lot of people out there who are actively pursuing a spiritual path outside of involvement in some kind of a religious community. Attendance matters. So let me give you, just here in closing, a kind of brief sketch of the different ways in which we see people related to that spiritual journey and their participation in religious communities. Sort of 4 spiritual populations, if you will. About a quarter of our population are people that I call the spiritually serious. These are people who do have active individual spiritual lives. They pray, they read scripture, they meditate, they engage in a variety of practices that are intentionally aimed at developing their spiritual lives, and they are deeply engaged in their local congregations. They attend, they enjoy the worship services, but more importantly, they also participate in adult education, mission groups, in small groups of various kinds. They're more likely to talk about things they do at church with their friends. They're more likely to be married to somebody who is in the parish and goes with them as well. In other words, there's a pattern of tying the spiritual life and the parish and the social relationships, the intimate conversations that these people are involved in, that shows up. Now, that pattern shows up across religious traditions. There are people like that in every religious tradition that we looked at. But it's more common among conservative Protestants and Latter-day Saints, where that kind of intimate involvement in small groups and frequent church attendance is part of the culture in those traditions. So, second pattern, the people I call the typical members. This is actually the largest group in the population. Really spans a pretty broad range, but these are people who are at least minimally interested in the spiritual life. They may not be particularly active in cultivating individual practices, but they're at least plugged in. They attend relatively regularly. They generally especially like the worship services, the preaching, the music, and so forth. But they're not particularly engaged with other things beyond the worship services. They're not as likely to participate in adult education and prayer groups and that sort of thing. Preaching and music, particularly important to this group of people, and that shows up in the fact that they're particularly prevalent among mainline Protestants and Black Protestants, where preaching and music are really important parts of how people think about what it means to go to church. Then there are the marginal members. These are people, again, across religious traditions, where the connections to the religious tradition have really pretty significantly frayed. They think of themselves as somewhat spiritual, but they're not really very active in doing anything to cultivate that spirituality. They have a religious affiliation, but they hardly ever go. And mostly they've just kind of drifted away, sometimes because they disagree with the beliefs of the religion that they grew up with. Sometimes, and we heard a lot of these stories, it's because at some critical moment in their lives, the church wasn't there, didn't care. And sometimes just because their life situation changes in some way, and that whatever tenuous connections they had got disconnected. But they're not completely disconnected. They still sort of think of themselves as sort of spiritual and kind of connected to, they're not nuns. No, they're still, they've got an identification with a religious tradition. There are, however, the truly disaffiliated, and they are, in fact, about the 15% or so of the population. These are people who have virtually no interest in spirituality. They're not part of a religious community. In our study, all but one of these people did actually start out in a religious tradition as they were growing up, but they left it pretty early. Disproportionately, these were Catholics. They are not necessarily the youngest cohort, actually. They're disproportionately present among the baby boomers. The baby boom generation sort of up and left and kind of hasn't come back. And they're the unaffiliateds that are now propagating unaffiliateds. So there is this population of people who really, mostly if they remember anything at all about their connection to religion, it's not particularly pretty. So, what do we learn by listening to those different populations of people who have very different relationships and different barriers or ease of entry back and forth into forming these religious communities? Well, just to repeat again, attendance matters. The deeper the communal involvement, the more active the person is in their individual spiritual life, and therefore the more that spiritual life gets lived out in everyday life in the world. We can also take from this the message that preaching and music are a kind of threshold, if you will. What people actually experience when they come to worship, because that's where they're probably going to come first, makes a difference in whether they're likely to ever come back again. But that's not enough to hold and deepen and develop a kind of religious and spiritual sensibility. What they need for that kind of deep engagement is opportunities for friendship, for learning, for service, and for conversation. Opportunities to talk with other people in a context in which making a connection between faith and everyday life can be part of the conversation. So, constructing communities of faith is critical in order to see that faith manifest out into the larger community, into the lives of the individuals who come into those communities, and in the effect it has on the larger community out there. Bottom line, lay ecclesial ministry is essential, both for individuals and for the communities in which those individuals are living. I hope we'll have lots of opportunity to unpack some more of this in the roundtable we're about to have. But thank you for your attention as you've digested your dinner.